This is the World Unpacked. Hey, it's Doug. Welcome back to the show. Last time we had State Department Counselor Derek Chollet on, we talked about U.S. policy towards Russia at the outset of Putin's war in Ukraine. This time, we're going to do our own pivot to Asia and talk about his recent visit with Secretary Blinken to the region. We're going to talk about the Quad, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the assassination of Shinzo Abe, North Korea, and much more. If you're a longtime listener, you'll remember Counselor Chollet well. His job at State is, as he described it, to be a middle linebacker, directing complex policies and responses to challenging situations. So let's get right into it. Here we go. Counselor Chollet, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back.
So you were just on a whirlwind tour of Asia a couple weeks ago. Tell us a little bit about why you were over there and what you were trying to accomplish.
Sure. It was a whirlwind tour. It was my fourth or fifth trip to Asia just in the last 9 months or so. On this particular trip, I was with Secretary Blinken, where he attended the Bali G20 ministerial hosted by Indonesia.
We're committed to managing this relationship, this competition, responsibly.
But of course, had bilateral meetings on the margins of the G20, including with the Indonesians, the Indians. Also had a trilateral meeting with the Koreans and Japanese. That was only just literally minutes after the news broke that former Prime Minister Abe had been indeed killed. We, of course, had been following it in real time overnight here in Washington, but got the news around midday Bali time about the shooting. But we, of course, weren't sure what exactly was happening until about 5 o'clock that afternoon. And we went ahead with the trilat, but were able to take that moment to reflect on Prime Minister Abe's legacy and just the significance of that loss and really the horror of that event.
So you started your answer by talking about the recently assassinated Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. So let's start there. How did you react when you first heard the news, as not just as a diplomat, but as a person, somebody who's been engaged in Asia?
Well, of course, I mean, shock and horror. And I know, most, if not all your listeners are very familiar with Japan and just can appreciate and know well how completely unusual and unheard of in modern Japan, there's political assassination. Of course, it's something that Japan saw a bit of 60, 70 years ago, but it's been quite some time since something like this had happened. And of course, gun violence is quite rare in Japan. So the double whammy of a gun being used against such a prominent, powerful, and indeed historic figure in Japan was just shocking. And so, of course, we all got the initial news. Just the fact that it happened at all was shocking. And we were getting reports over the course of that afternoon about his status. And of course, the final news that he had passed was quite shocking, depressing, and it caused, a lot of us to reflect on the significance of his leadership, the importance of the partnership the United States has with Japan, the legacy that he leaves, and many of the things that are some of the foundational policies of the Biden administration's approach to the Indo-Pacific. In fact, calling it even the Indo-Pacific. But in addition to the Quad, trilats with the Japan, Korea, and the U.S. I mean, these are very much the legacies of Prime Minister Abe. And it is a very different Japan in terms of its foreign policy than it was a decade ago or nearly 2 decades ago, in terms of its outlook on the world, its willingness to be more active in solving problems with the United States and other partners. And he leaves a significant legacy. And so the moment, I think, causes one to reflect on what he meant. And of course, just it seemed to be yet another, stressful data point in a world that seems to be, we of course have our own issues here in the United States, whether it's reflecting back on things that happened a couple of years ago to school shootings, and there seems every democracy, major democracy in the world right now seems to be under some degree of stress. Of course, it was the evening before we arrived, we got the news that Prime Minister Johnson of the UK was going to be leaving office. So, I mean, that doesn't compare to a political assassination, but nevertheless, just this sense of churn in the world and just the most unimaginable thing, it seemed, the assassination by a gun to someone like Shinzo Abe was just really hard to get your head around in the moment.
One of Shinzo Abe's legacies is a more robust vision of Japan's role as a security player, not just in Asia, but really globally. Japan is famously pacifist following the end of the Second World War. Do you think, well, I guess let me say, is that something that you think benefits overall U.S. policy in Asia to have a more robust Japanese security force? And is that something you think will continue past Shinzo Abe's legacy?
I do think it's unquestionably in America's interest to have more active Japanese leadership across the board, but particularly in the military realm. And our security cooperation has only grown over the last 15 years. And so I think we certainly see an important role for Japan to play in the security realm. Look, this is obviously difficult question for Japan in terms of its, post World War II journey. And of course, former Prime Minister Abe had talked about constitutional changes in Japan. But we found that our defense cooperation is only growing. Japan is doing some things in the region and also more broadly. I mean, Japan is providing non-lethal military assistance to Ukraine, which is a step I think not many would have expected we would have seen when we were talking here, I think, just before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this is something something meaning the Japan's evolution on military issues, as well as our cooperation on security and military issues, is something we are very keen to help promote.
Let's shift to South Korea. You met with a senior South Korean diplomat to talk about the U.S. Korea alliance. They just underwent their own leadership transition. U.S. policy on North Korea seems to be a little bit stuck. So what's the focus of the alliance now, and how do they fit into the regional security architecture in the Pacific?
Sure. Well, our relationship with South Korea, extremely important, has been for a long time. But with the new government, it was very important for us to begin engaging that new government right out of the gate. And of course, most importantly, President Biden, had a very successful visit to Seoul in late May.
Working with close partners who do share our values, like the Republic of Korea, to secure more of what we need from our allies and partners and bolster our supply chain resilience.
And Secretary Blinken has been there multiple times, and Deputy Secretary of State Sherman was recently there. And so we're having a steady pace of senior level visits to Seoul, but then of course hosting Korean friends here in Washington. And we see that, when we're looking out at all the aspects of our alliance, whether it's what's happening on the peninsula and ensuring that we can maintain peace and stability on the peninsula, and in the effort of trying to see a non-nuclear peninsula, or more broadly in the region when it comes to our cooperation to deal with regional threats, to address the many challenges coming out of PRC, to more broadly in the world. I mean, we see Korea, as a global security partner increasingly. And it was quite significant that at the NATO summit in Madrid, that we had for the first time the leaders of Japan and Korea and Australia and New Zealand there, the so-called A4, participating in that summit. I hope it's not, and I expect it's not the last time that those leaders will participate in a NATO summit. And I think it's a reflection of the fact how the kind of common security perspectives of our transatlantic alliance, as well as our Indo-Pacific alliances, are coming together. They're never going to be exactly identical because of just where countries sit on the globe, but we see great potential in how we can cooperate as like-minded democracies across that transatlantic and then Indo-Pacific space. And right now we have a terrific relationship with the current government in Seoul. We have a new ambassador, one of our most, if not our most experienced career diplomats. Phil Goldberg is newly arrived in Seoul. And we have a very ambitious agenda with our Korean counterparts. And so it was important for me to be able to go after, particularly after the Wang Yi meeting, to talk to them about that and also just the way forward generally.
I want to get into the Wang Yi meeting, and I also want to get into the NATO meeting. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about trade. Part of the U.S. effort in the region is on economics, not just security. And President Biden recently launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the IPEF. So tell us a little bit about this new initiative.
Sure. Well, IPEF was announced in Tokyo by the president about 6 weeks ago or so. It is not a new trade agreement, but it is a effort by the United States and 14 some countries that have signed up for IPEF to create new ways of cooperating across a range of economic issues that are really, in our view, going to really define the future in terms of building supply chain resilience or working on clean energy. And we've been heartened by the strong response by so many of our Asian partners. And the countries that have not yet signed up are asking about how they can sign up and working, on the ways that they're going to be participating in the IPEF. So we feel quite good about it, and the reception is to us a symbol or a signal of how much of a demand signal there is for active U.S. economic engagement throughout the Indo-Pacific. IPEF is being developed. I mean, the framework exists, and we have got the various working groups. But now the substance is what we are building out alongside our partners, and that's why it's a little bit different in that we are asking our partners to be part of the takeoff here and work with us on building this common agenda.
So right now, there are 3 agreements that set standards in the region on trade. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, obviously negotiated in part by the United States and then sort of abandoned.
CPTPP, right?
Right. Then we've got RCEP, of which China is an important part, and then DEPA, which is focused on digital trade. The acronyms don't matter, but what's important is that China is part of one of these and seeking to be part of 2 more, and the U.S. is outside of all of them. So how is IPEF going to compete or be an alternative?
Well, it's a different kind of agreement. And I think that, these trade issues are very difficult in many democracies right now, for a lot of good reasons. And so what we're trying to do here is take a new kind of approach on what we think in the areas we think are going to be defining the future increasingly. So, and what's interesting is that both in terms of the response we've been getting to IPEF and the desire for countries to be part of it. After early on, when it was announced, there was a lot of questions about what it might look like and what this means. And now there's generally excitement about being part of it. And I don't think it's looking to supplant any one of those things. But what's also interesting is we've seen this publicly and also heard it privately, some of the Chinese frustration with IPEF, and which to me is a signal that there's something there to it. So, I guess what I can say about it is watch this space. I mean, I think, we are in, we aren't where we were 10 years ago in terms of trade policy as a nation. And that's just a fact. And so IPEF is a new way of doing things. And it's a way that we think has a lot of potential. And now the onus is on us and our partners to realize that potential.
When we come back, we'll dig deep into U.S. China policy. Hey, World Unpacked listeners. I hope you're enjoying the episode. For more great episodes of the World Unpacked, make sure to hit that subscribe button on your preferred podcast platform. And tell all your colleagues at the State Department, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or just the next folks you have over for dinner that they should subscribe to. Thanks for listening. You mentioned the meeting with the Chinese official Wang Yi, and he at one point said that Southeast Asian nations should avoid being used as chess pieces by great powers, and otherwise had some pretty choice words for the outcome of that meeting with Secretary Blinken. So, what do you make of his response, and how should the U.S. sort of absorb and deal with this new positioning?
Well, I mean, obviously we reject that assertion completely, that that's the way the United States sees our ASEAN partners. I think, if anything, what our ASEAN partners have certainly experienced in the course of the last year and a half is increased U.S. engagement. Showing up at minister meetings, showing up at leader levels, showing up by people such as me and my colleagues here at the State Department. The U.S. ASEAN summit that President Biden hosted here in Washington in May was a historic event, the first time the ASEAN leaders had ever been together here in Washington.
It's been wonderful to host you all, the first ever U.S. ASEAN summit in Washington, D.C.
For some of them, it was the first time they had visited Washington ever. And whether we look at what we're doing together in the economic realm, security, what we're doing in areas like climate change and clean energy, it's in the diplomatic relations we have, it is truly significant. I would argue that the U.S. relationship with ASEAN is closer than it ever has been before. And what we say to all of our partners, whether they're in Southeast Asia or anywhere in the world, is that we are not asking them to choose between the U.S. and any other country, but we do want them to have a choice. And some of that having a choice is on us in terms of being available as partners and offering them things in terms of our partnership that they see as in their interest. We believe it would be, but we gotta be available as partners. But it's also for them to have the opportunity to choose their own destiny. And so, we've been very focused over the last several months here at the department, but in our community writ large on the Pacific Islands, and realizing that the United States needs to up its game in the Pacific Islands by making sure that people are visiting from Washington, and we've had a few visits already. We're going to have some more in the near future, but also increasing our diplomatic presence in the Pacific Islands. Some of this presence that had been downsized decades ago in the wake of the end of the Cold War, as well as, of course, looking at our various policy initiatives in that part of the world. It's obvious. China is trying to itself up its game in the Pacific Islands, and this is, I think we need to be strong partners with Pacific Island countries on the merits. But of course, when they're feeling increasing pressure in many cases from China, it's incumbent upon us to step up and be there as partners.
I'm glad you raised that because, and you also just mentioned how, we're not asking people to choose, and that's true, but some of them are choosing, right? And I'm thinking of the Solomon Islands, which initially had a controversial new security pact and then backtracked and said Australia is its security partner of choice and they won't host foreign military bases. So clearly we're seeing a Chinese effort to expand their relationship with Pacific Islands to project power. And I'm curious how the United States more granularly is offering an alternative to these states when their giant neighbor comes knocking.
Well, in some cases, like Solomon Islands, we have a long history that we can, we can tap into here. We have a partnership it is not a new relationship. Look, there are things that we have been doing that we can be doing more of in terms of ways that we're helping them meet the needs that they have, whether it's their security needs, whether it's their development needs, helping increase our ties as countries. It's something, by the way, we're not doing alone. It's something that we're working with the Australians in particular, New Zealand, talk about it with the Japanese, the Koreans, other like-minded partners. We have common interests in ensuring that the Solomon Islands or the Pacific Islands generally do not become a Chinese domain. I don't think that's what they're seeking either, by the way. So that's why I think that there is, for a lot of reasons, the U.S. has been not as engaged as it should have been over the last few years, particularly in the Pacific Islands, but other parts of the Indo-Pacific, and that's why we're committed to doing the work to be engaged.
Let's shift to the NATO summit now. And you mentioned already that for the first time, leaders of Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea participated. I'm also going to try to do my best IR class impersonation here, because there's a whole school of thought out there, realism, which is that countries are focused on their own interests. And you could argue maybe no other country but the United States has the sort of set of global interests that we have. Certainly, those nations I just mentioned who attended NATO probably don't have big self-interest in transatlantic issues. So can you give me your views on what underpins the strategy for these countries and why it's important that they attended NATO, why they're getting engaged on this?
Well, sure, Doug, it's a good question. I mean, look, I think NATO over the last several decades now has been about much more than just defending the territory of Europe. I mean, that is, of course, its core mission. But NATO has been engaged, obviously, for many years. It was engaged in places like Afghanistan or training missions in Iraq, but also increasingly on issues that really, truly know no border. Issues like cybersecurity or the climate, but also, and very significantly in this NATO strategic concept, which was the first strategic concept in over a decade that was released at the Madrid summit, recognizing the challenges emanating from the Indo-Pacific and specifically the challenges from the PRC, which were outlined in the NATO strategic concept. So, and if you take the Ukraine crisis, for example, it's a good kind of encapsulation of this, because the crisis in Ukraine is not just a crisis for Europe. I mean, of course, it is in Europe where the many consequences of the Ukraine war are being felt, whether it's in refugees or energy prices or the potential for the conflict spilling over in some kind. I mean, there's the center of the challenges are in Europe, but the consequences are much broader than that. I mean, obviously, food security, high energy prices, and energy security. Also, the principles at stake, the principles that sovereignty of states should matter, that one country, particularly a larger country, should not use force to assert its will over a smaller neighbor, the right of self-determination and the ability to defend your territory. I mean, basic principles that are enshrined in the UN Charter that our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific understand and care about as much as our allies and partners in Europe or anywhere else in the world. And I think what's notable, the shift that I've seen over the last decade or so, has been the desire by our partners in Europe to be closer to partners in the Indo-Pacific and vice versa. Whereas 10 years ago or so, it was harder to have that conversation. There might have been a broader strategic alignment, but there, kind of the point you were making earlier, the premise you were laying out of, well, how do the interests overlap here? I mean, aren't they too distant from one another? You really don't see that much anymore. And you've seen a sea change, I think, particularly in Europe, where countries like Germany in particular, France, others are really focused in on the challenges of the Indo-Pacific. They want to be part of the solution, and they want to increase those ties with partners like Japan and the Republic of Korea.
You take a look at Chinese reactions to various activities we do, or our allies do, to sort of read the tea leaves. And I'm curious, do you think the Chinese see this increased collaboration with NATO as a really substantive and strong effort to maybe not constrain them, but to sort of provide an alternative to the Chinese out there, to people who are looking around thinking, what's the West going to do to help me? Or, could they also credibly say, well, NATO is only unified when there's a war on their border, and otherwise they're sort of a little bit more fractious. This isn't that serious.
Well, Doug, I don't want to speak for the Chinese here, but I can tell you my assessment, which is, I think that they did not like the idea that the A4 showed up to the NATO summit. They didn't like the fact that the NATO strategic concept spoke quite clearly about concerns about what the PRC has been doing in the world. I think the conversation about the PRC in Europe has changed pretty fundamentally over the last several years. quite frankly, China's willingness to back Russia in the Ukraine war, which has been receding a bit recently, but that willingness has done great damage to their cause in Europe. I mean, of course, one of the bigger Chinese initiatives over the last several years has been to deepen its ties in Central and Eastern Europe. Well, it's kind of hard to do that when, from a Central Eastern European perspective, one of the greatest things that's happened to your country in the last quarter century is your entry into NATO. And if China is saying that entry into NATO was wrong and shouldn't have happened, and it's encroaching on Russian security, which is, of course, we completely reject that assertion. But if China is in fact taking Russia's line on that, that's not going to help them strengthen their ties in Central and Eastern Europe. And so I think they're having to grapple with that hard reality. But look, the NATO alliance is not becoming an anti-China alliance. I mean, that's not its purpose. But that said, if NATO is there's nothing exists like NATO anywhere else in the world. If NATO didn't exist, we would be racing to invent it. And to the extent that we can deepen the ties between our transatlantic allies and our like-minded Indo-Pacific allies, all the better. Because it seems really basic, but this idea that for all the problems we have out there, we're not going to be able to solve them alone. And the edge that the United States has is that we have allies. China has no allies. We have allies, and we have countries that want to be our allies. And you have to remember what being an ally means. Ally means you have committed to defend one another. U.S. has benefited from that. We often forget that. I mean, the only time the NATO mutual self-defense clause has been invoked was after 9/11, of course, right? Our allies coming to our defense. So that's why it's so important to strengthen our alliances, to build new alliances, and to find ways that we can bridge and strengthen ties between our existing alliances, right? In the Indo-Pacific to Europe. I mean, that's something that's unique to the United States.
We're big believers in diplomacy here at the Carnegie Endowment. I know you are. You work at the State Department. You pretty much have to be, but pretty much a basic qualification.
Even when I worked at the Pentagon, I believe I was a big proponent of diplomacy. So.
There you go. Good. Yeah. So, but I'm also thinking back to that first meeting that occurred between Secretary Blinken and Jake Sullivan and the Chinese, and I mean, the Anchorage meeting. Yep. It was downright hostile. I mean, this is not the sort of diplomacy that I can't really recall too many instances where things seemed so nasty. And that's not really an indictment of the United States. I mean, we're trying to engage. You're out there traveling all the time, talking to people, including the Chinese. I guess I'm curious. We're in this, what seems like a spiral where we can't get anything productive done with the Chinese. Is there any possibility of what might be described by the kids these days as a vibe shift or a new opening in U.S. Chinese diplomatic engagement anytime soon?
I confess I'd never heard of a vibe shift before, but
it's in the New York Times.
Okay. Well, look, a couple thoughts on that. I mean, what Secretary Blinken has often said that the U.S. China relationship is far too complicated to boil down into a single phrase or bumper sticker, and if you try to do it, you would need a very long bumper. And because there are aspects of the relationship that are certainly adversarial, where we fundamentally are going to disagree on an issue, and we need to be very clear and forthright on that issue and not have any ambiguity about where we stand. There are areas of the relationship that are competitive, and we very much welcome that competition. Secretary Blinken spoke to this quite clearly in his speech at George Washington University about competition, and we are not afraid of competition as long as we're competing to the top and we're competing by an agreed set of rules. And one of the challenges we've had with the PRC, we're very clear about this, is that they try to play by different rules. And there are areas of the relationship that we would hope and we aspire for them to be cooperative. Now, unfortunately, recently, as your question suggests, that's been a narrowing band of issues. But, I mean, some of this is just, it's self-evident, but climate change, for example. We are not going to be successful in addressing the consequences of a warming planet if we cannot find a way to cooperate with China. It's just as simple as that. So, of course, we are seeking to find ways that we can work together to address climate change. And we've made some progress along those lines. So, but it's going to take two. It takes two to vibe shift, I guess. I mean, going back to Anchorage, I thought that actually the moment that everyone saw in Anchorage, because I could say the meeting itself after that was not quite as sporty in terms of the level of tension that was on display. But I encourage your listeners to go back and watch that opening exchange where the Chinese side opened the meeting, Yang Jiechi opened the meeting with a quite extended critique of the United States, including us here at home and our flaws, which have frankly been on display for the world to see. And Secretary Blinken's rejoinder, I think, said a lot about the criticism we received, and the rejoinder to that, I think, says a lot about where we see ourselves and says a lot about China and the United States. Because Secretary Blinken said, "Yeah, we're flawed. We're not perfect." Like, that's one of the differences is we don't try to hide those flaws. I mean, we're having a quite extraordinary effort out of Capitol Hill right now to talk very candidly and transparently about one of our big flaws right now, and the challenges our democracy is facing. But part of the kind of ethos of the United States, something that's like literally woven into the fabric of our founding documents, is that we're striving for an ever more perfect union. Which the fact we're striving for an ever more perfect union indicates we're not perfect, and so we're trying to make ourselves better. And we believe that makes us more effective, more capable, and is better over time. And so we welcome the criticism, and we'll take it, and we'll try to, we'll push back when we think it's wrong, but then we'll also work to get it right when we think that there's merit to it. And we will be critical of ourselves. And so I think that kind of, that dynamic that we saw just encapsulated in that 20 minutes in Anchorage, I think says a lot about both those countries and why I think I still remain most confident by far in our future.
Councilor Chollet, Derek, thank you for coming back to the show, and we wish you all the best in your upcoming travels and diplomatic engagements.
Great. Thank you, Doug. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The World Unpacked, a podcast produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you like the show, please rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero, and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. See you next time.